In terms of action and excitement, this is definitely one of the most engaging weeks of our Old Testament Bible reading this year. But it is the very craziness of the book of Judges that often leads us wondering, what in the world am I supposed to take from these stories? So let's talk about that as we look at the rest of the book of Judges from chapter 7 to chapter 21. Okay, last week's reading told us about the cycle of the book of Judges, described early on in this next generation after Joshua that forgot the Lord. They would seek other gods. God would send an oppressing nation to punish them. They would call out to God for help. He would send a judge or a deliverer, and that deliverer would defeat the enemy and restore a time of peace until the cycle started over again and they sought after other gods. But as you read farther into the book, you begin to see the real character of the people that God is raising up, and you think to yourself, these are the men really that God would choose to deliver Israel? And you see their character flaws are really getting worse and worse with each judge. We begin with Gideon, who's okay at first, but by the end of his life has set up a shrine that becomes a place of idolatry. We have Jephthah talked about, who has all kinds of flaws and ends up sacrificing his own daughter at the end of a story because of a rash vow. And then maybe most famously, we have Samson, who really almost has no redeeming qualities, it seems like, for as arrogant and as violent and as driven by his own lusts as he is. And so it gives one a very clear picture of the state of things in Israel at this time. And it also shows the way that God continues to work with his people in spite of the moral degradation that is taking place. And we should also note, as we read through Judges, that it's interesting that in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, 4 of the judges, Barak, who was part of last week's reading, included, but in this week's reading, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson are mentioned among those who acted by faith when the Hebrew writer is looking back on these men and women of Hebrew history. And so it is worth asking as we read, well, in what senses did Gideon and Jephthah and Samson show faith? Maybe not throughout the entirety of their lives, but maybe there are particular moments in which they trusted in God and God gave them the victory because of their trust. But we shouldn't rule out the fact that God is also working with people in their wickedness, in their selfishness, and in their lack of respect for his laws. Well, the end of the book, the last 4 or 5 chapters, tells a couple stories that are difficult to read because of how violent and how disturbing they are. But there's this repeated phrase in the midst of these stories that give you a picture of how bad it really is, not just among the leadership, but amongst the everyday people. You see the kind of idolatry, the kind of violence, the kind of sexual sin, and the outrage, the civil war that ends up breaking out in Israel because, the text says, there was no king in Israel. That phrase is repeated several times. There was no king in Israel, and often it will tack on, and so everyone did what was right in his own eyes. A couple things are being signified here, maybe the most important of which is that whereas God was supposed to be their leader and being their king, they have abandoned him, and so now they are left to their own, and the result is disastrous. But it also says something about the lack of leadership among the people of Israel, and it gives us a little bit of glimmer of where this story is going to go. Notice in particular that there are a couple places referred to multiple times in these closing chapters of Judges. The town of Bethlehem in Judah and the town of Gibeah in Benjamin. And it just so turns out that Gibeah in Benjamin will be the hometown of the first king of Israel, Saul, and that Bethlehem in Judah is the hometown of the second king of Israel, David. And so we get this preview, or this little bit of a foreshadowing of those two locations to say a little bit about where this story is going. The people will ask for a king, and God will give them Saul, who is a king just like the rest of the nations. He's no different, really, than a king of the other peoples. But that God has planned that he will establish a king after his own heart, someone like David, who will rule with respect for God's commandments. So that's where the story is going when we get into 1 Samuel. But the book of Judges shows us that in this generation after Joshua, the people had totally forsaken the Lord. And what we see happening is a result of their disobedience to God's commandments and the horror that breaks out all across Israel because of that. So we'll get into Ruth and Samuel in next week's reading, but for now, enjoy, I guess, the stories of the book of Judges, and hopefully these things will be helpful for you as you read through the rest of